Picture this. It's July 1863. You're 22 years old. You've been marching for days through Pennsylvania heat. Your feet are blistered, your canteen is half empty, and somewhere ahead of you, you don't know exactly where, tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers are doing the exact same thing. Nobody told you this would be the battle. Nobody circled a date on a calendar and said, "This is where the war turns." You just kept walking, following orders, trusting your officers, and hoping you'd make it home. My name is Corporal James Whitfield, 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry, and I was at Gettysburg. Now look, I know you've read about Gettysburg in textbooks. Maybe you've seen the movie. Maybe you've visited the battlefield and stood on Little Round Top and tried to imagine what it felt like. But I want to take you somewhere different today. I want to put you inside the experience, the mud, the noise, the confusion, the fear, and yes, the strange moments of quiet in between. Because the real Battle of Gettysburg wasn't just a military campaign. It was 3 days of absolute chaos experienced by real people. Farm boys, factory workers, immigrants, teachers, who had no idea they were making history. So let's go back, all the way back to the summer of 1863. Before we get into the fighting, you need to understand why 2 massive armies ended up in a small Pennsylvania town in the first place, because it wasn't exactly planned. By the summer of 1863, the Confederacy had been doing surprisingly well. General Robert E. Lee had won significant victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and Southern morale was running high. But there was a problem, a serious one. The Confederate economy was struggling. Southern farms were being stripped to feed armies, inflation was brutal, and most importantly, Lee believed that if he could win a major battle on Northern soil, it might convince France or Britain to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation and provide military support. So Lee made a bold decision. He would take the fight north, into Pennsylvania. His army of Northern Virginia, roughly 75,000 men, crossed the Potomac River in June 1863 and started moving through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Towns like Chambersburg and York were occupied. Livestock was seized. Northern civilians, people who had never actually seen the war up close, suddenly found Confederate soldiers in their streets. Back in Washington, President Lincoln was watching this with serious concern. He replaced the Army of the Potomac's commander, again, this time putting General George Meade in charge just 3 days before the battle started. 3 days. Think about that. Meade barely had time to learn where all his corps were, let alone develop a grand strategy. Both armies were essentially feeling around in the dark, trying to locate each other through a network of scouts and cavalry. And on June 30th, 1863, a Confederate brigade marching toward Gettysburg to look for supplies, specifically shoes, there's a famous story about shoes, made contact with Union cavalry on the western roads leading into town. The next morning, July 1st, the shooting started. Neither side chose Gettysburg, it chose them. Now, I wasn't at the opening phase of the battle on July 1st. My regiment, the 20th Maine, was still marching. But I want to tell you what happened because it sets everything else in motion. The fighting on July 1st began northwest of Gettysburg, where Union cavalry under General John Buford made a decision that would shape the entire battle. His troopers, heavily outnumbered, dismounted and used their repeating carbines to delay the advancing Confederates. Buford understood something critical. The high ground south of Gettysburg, places like Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, was defensively superior. If the Union Army could hold that ground, they'd have a significant advantage. He bought enough time for Union infantry to arrive and set up a defensive line. But here's where things got complicated. The Confederates were pushing hard. Union General John Reynolds, one of the most respected officers in the Army of the Potomac, was killed early in the fighting, shot through the head while directing troops near a place called McPherson's Ridge. His death created confusion at a critical moment. Throughout the afternoon, Confederate forces from both the west and north hammered Union positions. The Union lines held for a while, then started to crack. By late afternoon, the Union troops were retreating, not routing, not running in panic, but conducting a difficult fighting withdrawal through the streets of Gettysburg itself, trying to reach those high-ground positions south of town. It was messy. Soldiers got separated from their units in the narrow streets. Civilians were sheltering in cellars. Wounded men were lying in yards and doorways. The town of Gettysburg, which had roughly 2,400 residents, suddenly found itself in the middle of a battle it had nothing to do with. The Union forces made it to Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Confederate General Richard Ewell, now commanding Stonewall Jackson's old corps, because Jackson had died after Chancellorsville, was ordered by Lee to attack those positions, if practicable. Ewell decided it wasn't practicable. He didn't attack. That decision is still debated by historians today. If Ewell had pushed forward aggressively that evening, the Union position might have collapsed. Lee might have won the battle on the first day, but Ewell hesitated, and by nightfall the Union army was dug in on high ground, with more troops arriving through the night. So when July 1st ended, the Confederates had won the day tactically, pushing the Union troops back, capturing thousands of prisoners, controlling the town of Gettysburg. But strategically, the Union army held the stronger ground. Let me take you back to where I was during all of this. The 20th Maine had been marching hard. And I mean hard. In the days leading up to Gettysburg, we covered enormous distances in brutal summer heat. Men were falling out of the column from heat exhaustion. Your feet develop blisters, and then the blisters burst, and then you're walking on raw skin inside your shoes with every step. You don't stop. You can't stop. The regiment was part of the 5th Corps, Army of the Potomac, and we were coming up from Maryland. We knew something big was happening. You could feel it, that shift in the air, the urgency in the orders, the way the officers stopped making jokes and started looking at maps more frequently. There were rumors. There are always rumors in an army. Someone said we were heading to a place called Gettysburg. Someone else said the Rebs had already taken York and were heading for Harrisburg. Another man said he heard we were going to swing around and cut off Lee's supply line. Nobody really knew anything. What I remember from that march is the heat and the dust. Pennsylvania roads in July, with tens of thousands of men and horses and wagons moving over them, turn into a kind of fine powder that coats everything. Your face, your uniform, the inside of your mouth. You're thirsty all the time. Your canteen runs out faster than you expect. And there's the weight. A Union soldier in 1863 carried somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds of equipment. Your rifle, a Springfield musket, weighs around 9 pounds. Then there's your cartridge box with ammunition, your cap pouch, your bayonet, your haversack with several days of rations, your canteen, your blanket roll, and whatever personal items you decided were worth carrying. After 10 miles, that weight feels like twice what it actually is. We marched through the night of July 1st into July 2nd. The mood in the column was quiet, that particular kind of quiet that experienced soldiers know. Not peaceful quiet, alert quiet. Everyone listening to the distant sound of cannon fire that had been rolling over us all day, that rumbling that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. When dawn came on July 2nd, we could see smoke on the horizon to the north, and we walked toward it. Here's something nobody really prepares you for when you first arrive at a major battlefield in progress. The smell. Before you see anything, before you hear the individual sounds of the fighting, you smell it. Gunpowder, yes, but also horses, mud, blood, smoke from burning buildings, and something else that's harder to describe. The smell of a large number of men who have been exerting themselves without the opportunity to bathe for days. It sounds almost mundane to mention that, but it's one of the first things that hits you. Then the sounds separate themselves out. At a distance, a battle sounds like one continuous roar, but as you get closer, the sounds start to differentiate. You can hear the percussion of artillery, that deep, chest-compressing boom, followed a few seconds later by the explosion of the shells somewhere ahead. You hear the rattle of musket fire, which at a distance sounds almost like a campfire, a crackling sound. You hear horses, you hear men shouting orders, and occasionally, if the wind shifts, you hear things you wish you hadn't. As the 5th Corps came up onto the battlefield on the morning of July 2nd, we could see the shape of the Union position. It's often described as a fishhook. Cemetery Hill at the bend, Culp's Hill at the barbed end to the northeast, and then the shank running south along Cemetery Ridge, ending at 2 rocky hills called Big Round Top and Little Round Top. General Meade had established his headquarters in a small farmhouse near the center of the line. Throughout the night and morning of July 2nd, his corps commanders had been arriving, conferring, positioning their men. The Union Army was essentially building a defensive line along those ridges and hills, trying to be ready before Lee decided how to attack. And Lee was going to attack. That much was clear. Lee's plan for the second day was to hit both ends of the Union line simultaneously. He would send General James Longstreet's corps to attack the Union left flank, that southern end of the line near the Round Tops, while Ewell would attack Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill on the Union right. The idea was to stretch the Union line, prevent Meade from shifting troops to reinforce any single point, and crack the position open. Longstreet, it should be said, had serious reservations about this plan. He thought Lee should move around the Union Army's left flank, find defensible ground, and force the Union to attack the Confederates instead of the other way around. Lee disagreed. He believed his army was in a strong enough position to attack, and he was concerned about the Union Army potentially slipping away if he maneuvered, rather than pressed. This disagreement between Lee and Longstreet is one of the most analyzed conversations in Civil War history. What would have happened if Lee had taken Longstreet's advice? We'll never know. What we do know is that Lee's plan for July 2nd came close to succeeding, alarmingly close. The attack was supposed to begin earlier in the day, but there were delays. Longstreet's troops had to conduct a concealed march to get into position without being observed by Union signal officers on Little Round Top. The march took longer than expected, and there were route changes when they realized they'd be spotted. By the time the attack actually stepped off, it was late afternoon. Meanwhile, something significant had happened on the Union side. General Daniel Sickles, commanding the Union 3rd Corps, which was supposed to hold the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, had made a decision. He didn't like his assigned position. The ground seemed low to him, and he saw higher ground in front of him. So, on his own initiative, without orders from Meade, he advanced his entire corps about 3/4 of a mile forward, creating a salient, a bulge, in the Union line centered on a peach orchard. Meade was furious when he found out. He rode out to confront Sickles in person and was in the middle of ordering him back when Confederate artillery opened fire. It was too late to withdraw. Sickles' men would have to fight where they stood. This created an enormous problem. A gap had opened between Sickles' position and the main Union line, and at the far southern end, Little Round Top, that crucial high ground, was completely undefended. Let me tell you about Little Round Top, because this is where I came in. And this is one of those moments in history where you can point to a specific decision made by a specific person in a specific place and say, this changed things. Brigadier General Gouverneur Warren was Meade's chief engineer, and on the afternoon of July 2nd, he rode up to Little Round Top to assess the situation. What he found was essentially nothing. A signal station with a small party of men, no infantry, no artillery, just an empty rocky hill. He looked south and west. He could hear the sound of Longstreet's attack beginning. Confederate forces were moving through the trees and terrain below him, and he understood immediately what would happen if Confederate infantry seized Little Round Top before Union troops could get there. From the top of that hill, Confederate artillery could fire directly down the length of the entire Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It would be like raking your finger down a row of dominoes. The whole position could unravel. Warren sent urgent messages to any nearby officers he could reach. He needed infantry immediately on that hill. The order found its way to Colonel Strong Vincent, commanding a brigade in the 5th Corps. Vincent didn't wait for formal orders to come back through the chain of command. He made the call himself immediately and started moving his 4 regiments up Little Round Top. The 20th Maine was one of those regiments, and we were placed at the far left end of the line, the absolute end of the entire Union position. There was nothing beyond us. If we gave way, Confederate infantry could sweep around our flank, get behind the whole Union army, and the battle would be over. Our Colonel, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, understood this. He walked the line and told us, in clear and plain terms, what was expected. We had to hold. We could not retreat. Whatever happened, this position had to be defended. I remember looking at the men around me. We were exhausted from the march. Some of the men in the regiment were recently arrived prisoners of war who had been given the choice between prison and re-enlisting. They'd been folded into our regiment just before the march. Not exactly ideal timing, and we could already hear the sounds getting closer. The attack came from Confederate troops under Brigadier General Evander Law. Alabama regiments, men who had been marching and fighting all day themselves, who were now moving through rocky, heavily wooded terrain at the end of a long assault. The first time you're under fire, there's a moment, just a fraction of a second, where your brain refuses to accept what's happening. The sound of bullets is different from what you expect. They snap. They crack past your ears with a sound that you feel as much as hear. They don't whistle the way they do in stories. The Confederates came up the rocky slope and hit our line. And then they pulled back. And then they came again. This pattern, assault, withdraw, reform, assault again, repeated multiple times, and each time they came, they were trying to swing further around our left flank, trying to find the end of our line. Chamberlain responded by extending our line further and further left, thinning it out until some places had men standing only a single rank deep. When the Confederate attack seemed to swing even further, he bent the left end of the regiment back, what's called refusing the flank in military terminology, creating an angle in the line so that we were essentially facing in 2 directions. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. In the noise and confusion, it's difficult to track exactly how long this fighting went on, but it felt like forever and no time at all simultaneously. Men were being hit. The regiment was taking casualties. Officers were shouting, trying to maintain order and direction in terrain that broke up any sense of a clean line. At some point, and I remember this with absolute clarity, the word came down the line. We were running out of ammunition, not almost out, essentially out. Men were going through the cartridge boxes of the fallen, trying to scrape together a few more rounds, and down below us, we could hear the Confederates reforming for another assault. Chamberlain made a decision that I still think about when I consider what courage actually looks like in practice. He ordered a bayonet charge. A bayonet charge downhill with exhausted men who had been fighting for however long we'd been fighting against Confederate troops who had numerical superiority. On paper, it makes no sense, but there was no other option. To stay in place with no ammunition was to be overrun. To retreat was to lose the hill and potentially lose the battle. The order went down the line. Fix bayonets. And when the signal came, the left end of the line swinging forward like a hinge, the rest of the regiment following, we went down that hill. The reaction from the Confederates was not what anyone might have expected. They were exhausted too. They'd been attacking uphill multiple times, and now, suddenly, the defenders were charging at them. The psychological effect was significant. Many threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others fell back. We captured a substantial number of prisoners and secured the position. Little Round Top stayed in Union hands. While the fight for Little Round Top was reaching its crisis point, the rest of the battlefield on July 2nd was scenes of extraordinary violence across multiple locations simultaneously. At the Peach Orchard, where Sickles had advanced his 3rd Corps, Longstreet's attack came directly into that exposed salient. Confederate artillery and infantry hammered the position from multiple sides. The fighting there was described by survivors as among the worst they'd ever experienced. The 3rd Corps was essentially shattered. Sickles himself lost a leg to artillery fire, and the Corps had to be relieved by other Union units. Further east, in a maze of large boulders called Devil's Den in the surrounding area, there was brutal close-range fighting among soldiers who could barely see each other through the rocks and smoke. The terrain around Devil's Den broke formations down to the level of small groups of men navigating between boulders, firing at muzzle flashes. At a wheat field that historians simply call the wheat field, control changed hands multiple times in the course of a few hours. Union troops advancing, Confederate troops pushing them back, Union reinforcements recapturing it, Confederates taking it again. Men were dying in a field of ripening wheat, while the grain around them caught fire from the burning cartridge wooding. North of there, as the afternoon extended into evening, Ewell's Confederate Corps attacked Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill on the other end of the Union line. There were moments where Confederate troops actually breached the Union lines, briefly capturing positions on East Cemetery Hill, before Union counterattacks drove them back. By the end of July 2nd, the battlefield was littered with casualties on both sides. The Union had held, but just barely. In multiple places, just barely. After the firing died down on the evening of July 2nd, there was a quality to the darkness that's hard to describe. Soldiers who had been fighting all day were now attempting to sleep on the ground in whatever position they'd ended up in. Some men were too exhausted to even eat what rations they had. Others, keyed up on whatever chemical the body produces during extreme stress, found sleep impossible and lay awake staring at the stars. The wounded were everywhere. The sounds of men in pain carried differently at night. They seemed clearer, more individual. During the fighting, when you're focused and moving, you can almost block it out. In the quiet hours of the night, you cannot. Details of soldiers moved through the darkness, collecting the wounded and carrying them to field hospitals. Field hospitals in 1863 were not hospitals in any modern sense of the word. They were typically set up in barns or farmhouses, with surgeons working by lamplight in conditions that we would consider completely unacceptable today. The primary surgical procedure was amputation. If a ball struck a limb and shattered the bone, the fastest and most reliable way to prevent the death by infection that would otherwise almost certainly follow was to remove the limb. The sound of a Civil War field hospital is something that veterans almost never spoke about publicly. It stays with you. Meade held a council of war with his corps commanders that night. He went around the table and asked 2 questions. Should the army stay and fight or withdraw? And if they stayed, should they attack or await the Confederate assault? The answer was nearly unanimous. Stay and wait for Lee to attack. Meade also made a prediction. He said he thought Lee would attack the center of the Union line the next day. He didn't know the specific details of what was being planned across the fields at Confederate headquarters, but his instinct was correct. Across those fields, Lee was planning something that would become one of the most famous military maneuvers, and one of the most controversial decisions in American military history. Lee had attacked both ends of the Union line and come very close to success in multiple places. His thinking on the morning of July 3rd was, essentially, both flanks are reinforced. Both flanks are strong. Therefore, the center must have been weakened to reinforce the flanks. He ordered a massive artillery bombardment, roughly 150 Confederate guns, to suppress Union artillery and break up the infantry on Cemetery Ridge. Then, 3 divisions of Confederate infantry, approximately 12,500 men, would advance across roughly 3/4 of a mile of open ground, strike the center of the Union line, break through, and split the Union Army in 2. Longstreet would command the assault but opposed it strongly. He told Lee he didn't believe any 15,000 men alive could take that position. Lee was convinced it would work. The man who would lead the assault was General George Pickett, commanding a division that had not yet been seriously engaged in the battle. There were also divisions under Generals Pettigrew and Trimble contributing troops. History has called it Pickett's Charge, though Pickett commanded only about a third of the men involved. But that's what it's known as, and I'll use that name here. Back on the Union side, on the morning of July 3rd, there was fighting at Culp's Hill as Union troops worked to dislodge the Confederates who had captured some positions the previous evening. That fighting went on through the morning and was eventually resolved in the Union's favor. But it meant that by midday, when everything went quiet, soldiers on Cemetery Ridge had already had a long day. And then the quiet stretched on and got longer. At approximately 1 p.m. on July 3rd, the Confederate artillery opened fire. I want you to understand what 150 cannons firing simultaneously actually sounds like, or more accurately, what it feels like. Because at a certain volume, sound stops being just something you hear and becomes something your whole body experiences. The ground shakes. Your vision blurs slightly. The air itself seems to vibrate. The bombardment was enormous. It was, by most accounts, the largest artillery barrage on the North American continent up to that point in history. The noise carried for miles. People in towns far from Gettysburg heard it. Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge responded. For roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours, the two artillery lines hammered each other across the open fields. The smoke built up until visibility was limited. On Cemetery Ridge, men hugged the earth behind stone walls and waited. Interestingly, and this is one of those quirks of military history, the Confederate artillery, while impressive in volume, was not as effective as it might have been. Many Confederate shells were overfiring, landing behind the main Union line rather than on it. The Union artillery chief, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, eventually ordered his guns to slow down and then stop firing, partly to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew was coming, and partly to lure the Confederates into thinking they'd suppressed the Union guns. It worked. The Confederate gunners believed the silence meant they'd achieved their objective. The artillery bombardment stopped, and then, out of the smoke and trees on Seminary Ridge, the Confederate infantry started to appear. If you've visited Gettysburg and you've stood on Cemetery Ridge and looked west across those fields toward Seminary Ridge, you have some sense of the geography. It's a wide-open expanse. There's a slight swale in the middle, some split rail fences, a few patches of scrubby trees. It looks peaceful now. It looks like farmland. On July 3rd, 1863, roughly 12,500 Confederate soldiers emerged from the tree line on Seminary Ridge and began advancing across that ground in formation. The sight of it, and I've talked to men from other regiments who were positioned on Cemetery Ridge during the charge, was described as something almost unreal. The formations were dressed, the flags were flying, the officers on horseback were visible. It looked almost like a parade, almost like a military exercise, and it was coming directly toward you. At first, from a distance, you watch, and you wait. Your artillery, those guns that had gone quiet earlier, opens up again, now firing with full effect into the advancing formations. You can see where the shells land. You can see the formations close up after each loss and keep moving. They keep moving. That's the part that gets you. They take casualties and they keep moving. Union soldiers on Cemetery Ridge were crouched behind a low stone wall that ran along the ridge. The position the Confederates were aiming for, the point toward which the whole advance was converging, was later named the Angle, a slight jog in the stone wall near a copse of trees. There, a Union general named Winfield Scott Hancock commanded the defense, riding up and down his line, exposing himself to fire to keep his men steady. He was wounded during the assault, but refused to leave the field. As the Confederate formations closed the distance, with artillery taking them from the front and Union infantry on the flanks beginning to fire into the sides of the advancing columns. The losses became staggering. Brigades that had stepped off from Seminary Ridge with 1,000 men were down to hundreds by the time they crossed the Emmitsburg Road fence and started up the last slope toward the stone wall. At the angle, Confederate troops under General Lewis Armistead actually breached the wall. Armistead, his hat on the tip of his sword so his men could see him through the smoke, led about 150 men over the stone wall and into the Union position. He got perhaps 50 yards past the wall before he was shot down. Union troops counterattacked immediately. The breakthrough, if it can even be called that, given how brief it was sealed. Confederate troops who had made it over the wall were killed, captured, or pushed back. On the flanks, the attack had already stalled. The whole advance began to break down and then reverse as men started moving back toward Seminary Ridge. What had been organized formations going forward became a much more disordered stream of men moving in retreat. The charge had lasted roughly 50 minutes. Of the roughly 12,500 men who had advanced, estimates of Confederate casualties range from about 5,500 to over 6,000. Somewhere between half and more than half of the attacking force killed, wounded, or captured. Entire regiments were gutted. Many brigades would never recover their strength. When it was over, Lee rode out to meet the survivors coming back from that field. The words he said, "This is all my fault," are one of the most quoted of the entire war. After Pickett's charge failed, both armies essentially stood and looked at each other. Meade and his officers debated whether to counterattack immediately, to hit the Confederate army while it was stunned and disorganized. The consensus was no. The Union Army had its own significant casualties. The men were exhausted, and Lee still had portions of his army in strong positions. The decision not to counterattack has been criticized by historians ever since, including by Lincoln himself, who believed Meade had let Lee escape when he could have potentially ended the war. But standing where Meade stood, knowing what he knew at the time, a battered army, uncertainty about Confederate strength, the memory of what had happened to Union commanders who attacked Lee aggressively in difficult conditions. The caution is understandable, even if it was arguably wrong. The army stayed in their positions through July 4th, Independence Day, 1863. It rained heavily. The wounded were being collected. The dead were being buried. Then, on the night of July 4th into July 5th, Lee's army began its withdrawal, moving south through Maryland in the rain with an enormous train of wagons carrying the wounded, a train that stretched for 17 miles. The Army of Northern Virginia was heading back to Virginia. Meade followed cautiously. The retreat turned into something of a race to the Potomac River, which had been swollen by rain. Lee's army was trapped briefly on the north bank, and Meade moved to cut them off. But Lee's engineers built a makeshift bridge. The army crossed on the night of July 13th. Lincoln was, by multiple accounts, genuinely upset about this. He had hoped for the kind of decisive blow that would cripple or destroy Lee's army. It hadn't happened, but what had happened was still enormously significant. Let's talk about the numbers for a moment, because sometimes in history the numbers get abstracted, turned into statistics that stop meaning anything. I want you to actually sit with these. Over 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg produced approximately 51,000 casualties on both sides combined. Union casualties were roughly 23,000, killed, wounded, or missing. Confederate casualties were somewhere between 23,000 and 28,000. The Confederate records are less precise. 23,000 Union soldiers. 23,000. The town of Gettysburg had a population of 2,400. In the days after the battle, the roughly 21,000 wounded men who couldn't be immediately moved were still in Gettysburg and the surrounding area. The town was overwhelmed. Every church, school, and large building became a hospital. Farms for miles around were used as medical facilities. Civilians, many of them women since most of the men had fled or been conscripted, worked alongside military surgeons to care for the wounded. The smell of a town with that many wounded and dead, even after burial details worked for days, reportedly carried for miles, depending on the wind. Townspeople who returned after the battle found their homes and farms in various states of destruction, their livestock taken, their fences torn down for firewood or fortifications. For the soldiers who survived, Gettysburg wasn't something that ended when the armies left. It lived in you. Men who had charged up or been charged down Little Round Top, who had stood at the stone wall while 12,500 men walked toward them, who had fought hand to hand in the wheat field or among the boulders of Devil's Den. They carried those 3 days for the rest of their lives. The 20th Maine left Gettysburg with 135 men killed or wounded out of roughly 385 who had fought on Little Round Top. More than a third. Historians disagree about many things, but there's a fairly strong consensus that Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg the very next day on July 4th, 1863, represented a genuine turning point in the Civil War. Before Gettysburg, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had never been decisively defeated. It had won at Bull Run, at Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville. The Confederacy's best chance for survival was to make the war so costly, so exhausting that the Northern public would demand a peace settlement. A string of Confederate victories, especially on Northern soil, fed that hope. After Gettysburg, that path became much harder. Lee's army had taken casualties it could not easily replace. The offensive strategic initiative, the ability to choose when and where to fight, shifted toward the Union. Lee would fight brilliant defensive battles for the remainder of the war, but he would never again mount a major offensive into the North. The foreign recognition that the Confederacy needed, particularly from Britain, which had been ambivalent about the war, also became significantly less likely after Gettysburg. A Confederacy that couldn't win on Northern soil was a harder sell to European powers who were evaluating whether to recognize it. And perhaps most importantly, Gettysburg shaped the political conversation in the North in a way that made it harder for peace Democrats, people arguing for a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy, to gain traction. The Union had held. The Army had not broken. The cause, however costly, seemed winnable. This is the context in which on November 19, 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The cemetery being created to properly bury the Union dead who had been hastily interred on the battlefield. The main speaker that day was Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for roughly 2 hours. Lincoln's remarks took about 2 minutes, 272 words. But those 272 words, the Gettysburg Address, became perhaps the most famous speech in American history, redefining the purpose of the war and connecting the fight to the founding ideals of the nation. Lincoln said the men who died there had consecrated that ground beyond anything the living could add or detract. What was needed was for the living to commit to the unfinished work, to ensure that those men had not died in vain, and that the nation would have a new birth of freedom. Before I wrap up, I want to spend a moment on something that gets lost when we talk about battles in terms of maneuvers and call and strategic decisions. There were individual people at Gettysburg. Private George Sanderson of the 1st Minnesota was part of a regiment that was ordered to charge into a Confederate advance on the evening of July 2nd to buy time for Union reinforcements to arrive. The regiment went in with 262 men and came out with 47. A casualty rate of over 80% in roughly 5 minutes. Those men knew what they were being ordered into. On the Confederate side, there was Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, who led his men over the stone wall during Pickett's charge. His close friend, one of his best friends from before the war, was Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the very troops defending that wall. When Armistead fell, mortally wounded, Hancock was wounded nearly simultaneously about 500 yards away. Both men were carried from the field. Armistead died. Hancock survived. Think about that. Two men who had been close friends, who had served together in the pre-war army, now on opposite sides of the most crucial moment of the entire battle. There was John Burns, a 72-year-old civilian resident of Gettysburg, a veteran of the War of 1812, who took his musket and went out to fight with the Union soldiers on July 1st because it was his town and he wasn't going to sit in his house. He was wounded 3 times and survived. There were the women of Gettysburg, women like Mary Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, struck by a stray bullet while baking bread for Union soldiers. Her death was random and senseless in the way that many deaths in war are. And there were the families of the soldiers killed, families who received letters, or sometimes learned through the grapevine before any official notification, that a son or husband or brother was dead, who then had to somehow integrate that absence into the rest of their lives, for decades to come. Gettysburg was not just a battle. It was an event that touched hundreds of thousands of individual lives and rippled out through those lives for generations. When I think about what Gettysburg meant to me, and I have had many years to think about it, a few things stand out. First, the contingency of it all, how close things came to going differently multiple times. If Buford hadn't held the western approaches on July 1st, if Warren hadn't spotted the undefended Little Round Top when he did, if Chamberlain had ordered a withdrawal instead of a charge, if Sickles hadn't advanced his corps and created a gap, if Ewell had attacked Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 1st when it was still poorly organized, if Longstreet's attack on July 2nd had begun 3 hours earlier. Any one of those things going differently might have changed the outcome, and the outcome of Gettysburg might have changed the outcome of the war. History has this tendency, when you look back at it, to seem inevitable. The Union won the Civil War, so we tell the story in a way that makes it feel like the Union was always going to win. But standing on that hillside on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, with ammunition running out and Confederates reforming below, it did not feel inevitable. It felt extremely uncertain. Second, and this is something that every person who has been in combat understands, I think, the experience strips away a great deal of abstraction. You stop thinking about causes and ideologies and strategic objectives. You think about the men next to you. You do what you do because of the men next to you. The broader meaning comes later, if it comes at all. In the moment, it's much more immediate than that. And perhaps most importantly, Gettysburg shaped the political conversation in the North in a way that made it harder for peace Democrats, people arguing for a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy, to gain traction. The Union had held. The Army had not broken. The cause, however costly, seemed winnable. This is the context in which on November 19, 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, the cemetery being created to properly bury the Union dead who had been hastily interred on the battlefield. The main speaker that day was Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for roughly 2 hours. Lincoln's remarks took about 2 minutes, 272 words. But those 272 words, the Gettysburg Address, became perhaps the most famous speech in American history, redefining the purpose of the war and connecting the fight to the founding ideals of the nation. Lincoln said the men who died there had consecrated that ground beyond anything the living could add or detract. What was needed was for the living to commit to the unfinished work, to ensure that those men had not died in vain, and that the nation would have a new birth of freedom. Before I wrap up, I want to spend a moment on something that gets lost when we talk about battles in terms of maneuvers and corps and strategic decisions. There were individual people at Gettysburg. Private George Sanderson of the 1st Minnesota was part of a regiment that was ordered to charge into a Confederate advance on the evening of July 2nd to buy time for Union reinforcements to arrive. The regiment went in with 262 men and came out with 47. a casualty rate of over 80% in roughly 5 minutes. Those men knew what they were being ordered into. On the Confederate side, there was Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, who led his men over the stone wall during Pickett's charge. His close friend, one of his best friends from before the war, was Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the very troops defending that wall. When Armistead fell, mortally wounded, Hancock was wounded nearly simultaneously about 500 yards away. Both men were carried from the field. Armistead died. Hancock survived. Think about that. Two men who had been close friends, who had served together in the pre-war army, now on opposite sides of the most crucial moment of the entire battle. There was John Burns, a 72-year-old civilian resident of Gettysburg, a veteran of the War of 1812, who took his musket and went out to fight with the Union soldiers on July 1st because it was his town and he wasn't going to sit in his house. He was wounded 3 times and survived. There were the women of Gettysburg, women like Mary Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, struck by a stray bullet while baking bread for Union soldiers. Her death was random and senseless in the way that many deaths in war are. And there were the families of the soldiers killed, families who received letters, or sometimes learned through the grapevine before any official notification, that a son or husband or brother was dead, who then had to somehow integrate that absence into the rest of their lives, for decades to come. Gettysburg was not just a battle. It was an event that touched hundreds of thousands of individual lives and rippled out through those lives for generations. When I think about what Gettysburg meant to me, and I have had many years to think about it, a few things stand out. First, the contingency of it all, how close things came to going differently multiple times. If Buford hadn't held the western approaches on July 1st, if Warren hadn't spotted the undefended Little Round Top when he did, if Chamberlain had ordered a withdrawal instead of a charge, if Sickles hadn't advanced his corps and created a gap, if Ewell had attacked Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 1st when it was still poorly organized, if Longstreet's attack on July 2nd had begun 3 hours earlier. Any one of those things going differently might have changed the outcome, and the outcome of Gettysburg might have changed the outcome of the war. History has this tendency, when you look back at it, to seem inevitable. The Union won the Civil War, so we tell the story in a way that makes it feel like the Union was always going to win. But standing on that hillside on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, with ammunition running out and Confederates reforming below, it did not feel inevitable. It felt extremely uncertain. Second, and this is something that every person who has been in combat understands, I think, the experience strips away a great deal of abstraction. You stop thinking about causes and ideologies and strategic objectives. You think about the men next to you. You do what you do because of the men next to you. The broader meaning comes later, if it comes at all. In the moment, it's much more immediate than that. Third, I think about the men on the other side. The Confederate soldiers who came up that hill in Alabama, heat, tired, attacking an entrenched position multiple times, dying in significant numbers before eventually being driven back. They were brave. They were fighting for something they believed in. Even if what they believed in was wrong, even if the institution they were defending was a moral catastrophe. They were human beings in an extreme situation, and they met it with courage. I don't say that to excuse the Confederate cause, because I cannot excuse it. The Civil War was fought, at its core, over the question of whether 4 million human beings would remain enslaved. That is not something history should soften or equivocate about. But the individual Confederate soldiers, the men in the ranks, most of whom owned no enslaved people, and were fighting because their state had seceded and their community expected it, were not cartoon villains. They were people, and they died in enormous numbers at Gettysburg too. The battlefield at Gettysburg is one of the most visited historic sites in the United States. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people walk the ground, stand on Little Round Top, walk the distance of Pickett's charge. Visit the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Why do people keep coming back to it? I think it's because Gettysburg sits at the center of something Americans have been trying to understand about themselves for a century and a half. The Civil War was a defining American experience, a moment when the country nearly split in two, when the question of whether the founding ideals applied to all people or only to some was put to an ultimate test. Gettysburg was the moment where the Union came closest to losing, and didn't. There's something in that which feels important to witness, to walk, to try to understand. The monuments on the battlefield, and there are hundreds of them placed by veterans and their states in the decades after the war, are an extraordinary record of people trying to say, "We were here, this happened, remember it." Union and Confederate monuments stand on the same ground. The battlefield itself has been the subject of ongoing historical and cultural debates about how to interpret what it means, whose stories to center, how to honor the dead without romanticizing the cause some of them died for. Those are good debates to have. They're the debates of a country still working through the implications of its history. I want to leave you with one final thought. The men at Gettysburg, on both sides, were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. They didn't always do the right thing. They made mistakes, they got scared. They sometimes ran and sometimes stood when standing seemed impossible. They were people, and they paid an extraordinary price. When Lincoln said at that cemetery dedication that it was for the living to commit to the unfinished work, the work of ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not perish from the earth, he was putting the weight of those deaths on the shoulders of everyone who came after, not as a burden, as a purpose. Gettysburg doesn't ask you to have simple feelings about it. It asks you to look at what human beings are capable of, the courage and the brutality and the sacrifice and the error, and to take that seriously. To understand that the freedoms and the nation that those men were fighting over were not given, were not inevitable, were paid for in 3 days of extraordinary violence on a hillside in Pennsylvania. That's worth remembering. That's worth understanding. And if this is the first time you've really dug into what happened at Gettysburg, I hope it won't be the last. Go read about the individual regiments. Look up Joshua Chamberlain's account of Little Round Top. Read about the 1st Minnesota. Read about what Gettysburg looked like from the Confederate side. Read about Pickett's men and what the survivors said about crossing those fields. The history is there, and it's extraordinary, and it belongs to all of us. If you found this video worthwhile, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We do deep dives like this into historical events from the ground level, trying to get at what it actually felt like to live through history rather than just read about it in a textbook. Drop a comment below and let me know. Which part of the Battle of Gettysburg do you find most fascinating? The defense of Little Round Top? The failure of Pickett's charge? The decisions Lee and Meade made under pressure? I read every comment, and your questions and perspectives often shape future videos. If you want to go deeper on this, I'd recommend visiting the Gettysburg National Military Park. The rangers there are exceptional, and the walking tours of the battlefield are genuinely worth your time. The park's museum and visitor center has one of the better collections of Civil War artifacts I've encountered anywhere. And if you enjoyed this, check out our previous videos on other turning points of the Civil War. We've covered Antietam, Chancellorsville, and the Siege of Vicksburg, all trying to bring the same ground-level perspective to events that shape the country we live in today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.